All right, let's get started. Thank you all very much for your interest in this important panel discussion today on cybersecurity in the energy industry. Now, before we get started, we'd like to express our deepest support for Ukraine in its fight against the Russian invaders and for the pursuit of their independence as a sovereign nation. This is a wholly unnecessary tragedy which has disrupted the peaceful lives of Ukrainians forever, and we will not forget. Now, perhaps ominously, cyber activity has stepped up considerably over the past 12 weeks, which has unfortunately provided an important backdrop to this conversation today. And I'm confident that you'll find the discussion enlightening and very stimulating. Now, the format of the panel is very simple. We're going to discuss four broad themes that are driving this conversation about cyber and cyber readiness. I'll just pop these up on the screen so you can see what they are. We're going to look at board engagement and how to engage the board, cyber hygiene in the world of operating technology and operating infrastructure, convergence, the bringing together of IT and OT, and how risk management has changed over the course of the evolution of the cyber pressures that we're facing, as well as the rise of digital innovations and the like. Now, our panel today has been carefully selected to provide a full range of perspectives. And before we begin, I'll invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and describe their work in cyber. That way you'll have at least a context or a baseline for where our remarks are coming from. Now I'll start. My name is Jeffrey Can. I'm an author and professional speaker and a trainer on digital innovation in oil and gas. My passion is what takes place at the intersection of these two great industries. My most recent book is called Carbon, Capital, and the Cloud, a playbook for digital oil and gas, and it sets out the leading practices for companies to accelerate their adoption of digital innovation. Now, to introduce the rest of the panelists, I'll begin with Jay. Over to you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Jay Gignac, 20 years in cybersecurity. Been interested in advisor roles, consulting, worked for partners, services, vendors, and shifted over to operational technology security or industrial cybersecurity about 7 to 8 years ago. And I've been assisting clients in understanding their environments, making sense of the risks, and helping them move forward in understanding their environments.
Thank you very much. Now to Darren.
Hi, my name is Darren Wesley. I've been working in the IT industry since I got my start as a summer student for a large construction company, and it sort of got me interested in the whole IT road. So I did that for a decade, and then I moved into oil and gas, downtown Calgary, working there for another decade. And then before starting with ACSI last October, I spent 6 years with the city of Calgary in the cybersecurity operations. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. And last and certainly not least, Gary.
Thanks, Jeffrey. My name is Gary Sockrider, and I've been working in networking and internet security for over 2 decades. My focus is on understanding the constantly evolving threat landscape, conveying that to others, as well as seeking to help others implement the solutions and techniques that solve the challenges that they pose.
Thank you very much, panelists, and really looking forward to this. Our first topic today, as I mentioned, is board engagement. And boards are critically important in dealing with the issues associated with cyber threats and cyber activities, because it's their role to endorse actions that managers need to take. And of course, our most recent high-profile cyber action against an oil and gas infrastructure was Colonial Pipelines in the last 18 months, which disrupted fuel supplies across the eastern United States. But cyber activity, as I mentioned, has stepped up dramatically in Europe because of the effects of the war, as the two combatants stage cyber warfare against each other in parallel with their actions on the ground. So what does this mean exactly for us, and how do we then engage the board? Here's some of the questions and considerations for board engagement that I'd like us to talk through today. So first, what is the assessment of board readiness? Where and how are boards dealing with this? What do we need to do by way of education to help boards and board members improve and grasp the severity and the issues that we're facing? What are the different terminology questions that board members need to be brought up to speed? The world of cyber is full of arcane words and names, doxing and phishing and the like. How do we help board members grasp what this all stands for? And then finally, what are the kinds of practices that companies are pursuing to help boards become better equipped to do their jobs? So Jay, let me begin with you. You travel extensively in your role. What is your assessment of the preparedness of boards to deal with cyber activities they face today?
So I think that the good factor is that most boards are aware now that cybersecurity is important. I think that battle has been won over time. Now, you said it. I think that one of the challenges in security is that we tend to be technical and we tend to leverage terminology which makes sense to us, and there's a wealth of acronyms that mean nothing to the business. So I think a couple of challenges would be to first understand who is part of your board and understand their profile and backgrounds, so that you have the ability to convey your points and educate them and bring awareness to what you're trying to solve as a problem. I think it's important to have a plan to help them understand why we're spending what we're spending and the results that are going to occur from that spending and how it fits into the overall security plan of the company, both IT and OT sides. So we are getting more converged from a role perspective. So I think it's important that we bring awareness to the fact that there are risks that need to be quantified. And we need to be able to translate that in common language in order to convey those points across so that they understand. It's very hard to prove ROI in security spending. It's about loss prevention. It's more about proactivity. It's more about identifying risk and preventing the bad things from happening. And I think that's where the conversation needs to be focused, but well expressed, to the point, factual, and educating in the process. It's not easy, but it's something that is crucial if we're going to increase the spending that is required and bring the awareness to the problems that we're facing.
Now, Gary, you mentioned in your introduction that you've devoted basically a career to helping explain and evangelize the issues associated with cyber to the marketplace. What is your assessment of board awareness and preparedness to deal with cyber?
Yeah, look, Jay made some really good points. The boards are understanding more and more over time, the criticality of cybersecurity to their business. But I think it's a mixed bag. On some boards they have cybersecurity experts as board members. Other boards have no in-house expertise and maybe rely on the CISO or the CIO or others within the company. Some rely on third-party consultants. And so, I think really what we need to focus on is how do we engage the boards better? And from my perspective, again, I think Jay said the most critical piece, which is risk. Boards today already understand risk. This is something that they're very comfortable dealing with. It is part of their day-to-day job, assessing the risks to the business, to their infrastructure, to their assets, and then mitigating those risks appropriately. And if we can speak to them about cybersecurity in terms of risk, which they very well understand, then I think we're going to make a lot more progress. So rather than trying to keep them up to speed on all these acronyms and what the latest threats are, I think that's probably a little bit level below the board, but letting them understand the risks and letting them make those risk-based value judgments, I think that's the key.
Your point about framing this as a risk conversation with boards makes complete sense to me. What are the kinds of, how do you explain what the risk is when you can't, or you are unable to really go into the details about cyber concerns and considerations?
Yeah, I think it's really simple. I mean, some analogies would help. When we think about cyber attacks, you can compare cyber warfare to actual warfare, right? To physical warfare. I mean, we know that these events occur concurrently. It's happening now in Ukraine. It's happened in the past in Chechnya and Crimea and other parts of the world. We also know that we can quantify the risk. So if you understand that, say, ransomware could prevent you from accessing critical intellectual property or prevent you from doing online transactions that generate revenue, that's a quantifiable risk. And so you don't have to understand the nature of the attack. You just need to understand, what is the impact should a cyber criminal be successful or a nation state be successful against you. That's all you really need to know.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a bit like trying to understand how a carburetor works in your car. You don't have to understand how it works to be able to appreciate that you need it. And so I think that's a useful analogy as well to bring it to places where people are, rather than trying to take them to a place they're unfamiliar with. Darren, what's been your experience, perhaps not with boards, but with management teams, trying to help people who are not deep in this world come to grips with what we're up against?
One of the good examples I've relied on in the past is the good old business case, going back and looking at past events to try and educate on where those types of risks apply to the business at hand, and solving it that way. Learn from experience or from history.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated with the engagement with boards. Just prior to the pandemic, I was in Toronto briefing a board on my first book, and they were literally just coming out of a cyber ransomware attack. And their biggest concern was, as a board, why would we proceed with digital transformation if all of it's going to do is open us up to more attacks? If you're trying to explain to a board, Jay, just here's why you need to do both. You can't just stop the business. You also have to keep the business running and evolving. How do you help a board come to grips with this paradox that the more they put into innovation and digital transformation, electronics and so forth, the greater the risk they face of being attacked?
Yeah, I think your question is excellent. So there's an imbalance currently in terms of how we've been managing the business. So we can go back 30 years and we can look at the practices that were used in modernizing our environments, and convergence has been happening for a long time. So has transformation, right? So the business has better KPIs. They have better presence in the production environments or in operational facilities. You have multiple service providers that are ensuring safety, reliability, and productivity. So these things are very important to operational environments. They come at a cost, though. So there's a direct correlation with the connectivity as well as the implementation of new devices and assets that we're putting into our environments and the exposure that's related to them. And this is something that's been going on for a very long time. So if you combine that with the fact that traditionally hygiene issues between IT and OT and the culture that exists between IT and OT, and the lack of transparency between both sides, as well as the ability to understand the visibility that is required, has led us to the situation that we're in now. Latent insecurity in operational environments and poor understanding of how we're actually very porous and that we're hyper-connected, and that in some circumstances, IT has presence in OT up to 80 or 90% of the assets that are accessible from the IT environment, which is not something that's desirable, but without the ability to audit yourself or get that very necessary visibility, it's difficult to make a statement as to where you lie and how you have the ability to both audit and enforce the air gap that we relied for years, or the security by obscurity that we've had in place for a certain period of time.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating development. Let's turn to the last part of this question around board engagement, which is, what are the latest practices for engaging boards? Over the pandemic, for instance, we've had 2 years of literally no travel, no face-to-face meetings, no tours. How are we helping boards in this new environment come to grips with this? Gary, let me start with you. How are you engaging with these leadership teams these days in light of the pressures that we're under from the pandemic?
Well, I think, we've adopted in the same way everyone has during the pandemic, right? We can't rely as much on in-person meetings or site visits or the types of engagement that we had in the past. but it doesn't mean we should stop engaging, right? So I think whatever's going to work, depending on what part of the world you're in, depending on your local restrictions, depending upon the technology available to you and the comfort, that the board has in using that technology. I think, the best practice is really just about staying engaged and continuing to have the conversation from my perspective. I don't really particularly care about how we engage. I think that should be custom tailored to every individual board and the people that they're looking to engage with.
Yeah, some companies I know do simulations. For instance, you've just had a cyber ransom attack, and what are you going to do about it? And they pull the board in to sort of play along with this kind of simulated warfare. Jay or Darren, have you done anything similar like that to help organizations come to grips with how fast you get a cyber attack like that? How fast things deteriorate and the kind of decision processes you need to stand up? I'll start with you,
want to
Jay.
go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Jay. Yeah.
Yeah, so tabletop exercises are very useful. They tend to demonstrate the security culture within a business. It also helps you assess your processes and controls that you might have, at least from a soft perspective. So I'm not talking about technical controls, but certainly in terms of assessing how your teams respond. Do you have an incident response process for the OT environment? When was it maintained? Who would you refer to? And then you get to play with the circumstances, which is always very useful because you're presenting scenarios that are unprepared, but they're very realistic. And you don't have to go big. You can start small. It's a good practice, and it helps promote cybersecurity culture within the business. And it brings different stakeholders to have visibility on the posture that the business has and areas of improvement. We always refer to people, process, technology. It's very easy to buy tools. Deploying them, using them properly, and training your people, as well as having the right processes that support the business. Because at the end of the day, security needs to be an ally. It needs to support the business and enable where the business needs to go. So there's tremendous value that comes not from only a security perspective, but from a visibility, awareness, and interaction with the board. One of the things that Gary referred to, it's custom for every business because the board will be made up of different individuals with different backgrounds, different tenure, and it's important that you adapt the messaging as well as the interaction to that, so that you can engage them in the challenges that the business is facing.
And Darren, let me turn last words to you around practices that you've seen that work.
Yeah, tabletops are a great example. I would just say, the first time you go through a scenario like that, do you want it to be real or do you want it to be a practice session? So you want to do it, practice it a few times. You're going to find issues with your process. It's going to happen. Nothing's perfect the first time you ever do it. So definitely practice, practice, practice.
Practice, practice, practice. Sort of takeaway number one. All right, let's turn now to this question of cyber hygiene. With the cyber world now able to leverage effectively the exact same technologies that we are using to improve the performance of our business, it means that our ability to, and the baseline we use for assessing the hygiene of our capabilities internally now needs to step up. So I want to talk a little bit about how cyber hygiene definitions may be changing, how the baseline is moving around. What is the impact of hygiene factors now in our more machine-to-machine world? And finally, what are some of the practices companies are now deploying to assess and detect the caliber of their cyber hygiene practices? So Gary, let's start here on this whole question of definitions. What exactly, when we say cyber hygiene, what exactly does that mean? And is the definition moving around in light of the situations that we are all in today?
Yeah, well, look, simply put, we've just borrowed this term of hygiene from where we apply it, say, in a sense for medical applications, or other applications.
Yeah.
Right. So, hygiene is about maintaining best practices. It's about doing maintenance. It's about understanding, what things can impact you if you fail to maintain that hygiene. So, I don't think anyone really needs to understand hygiene and to translate into the cyber world. it means things like, using modern techniques, right? There was a time when we thought that, keeping meat out on the counter was a perfectly reasonable, hygienic way to store it. But now we know that if we refrigerate it, we're going to have better outcomes, right? And so, we look at things that are developing now, multi-factor authentication, zero trust models. There's so many areas. We have to worry now about ransomware and phishing attacks. We have to worry about malicious insiders. These are all things that are part of understanding how we maintain that hygiene. So, it is changing, to your point, as we move into this digital transformation where we now have public cloud, private cloud, we have our own private networks, we have, combinations of those. Assets are all over the place, and sometimes we don't even know where everything is, right? So, I'd say a good start to that hygiene is understanding, where you need to apply it and where you have gaps. So I think it is a lot of moving parts and something we have to stay on top of.
And it does change regularly. There was a recent case study of a deep fake. This was an audio deep fake, but it was an instruction to an employee in Alberta to release funds. And the employee was dead sure it was the boss talking, and they released the funds and they disappeared. So our hygiene factors, that was a threat that I wouldn't have thought in my lifetime was suddenly real. Now it's quite real. It's happening. Darren, in your experience, to what degree is the sort of baseline of what we think about as appropriate hygiene, how is it now shifting or adjusting in light of the fact that we have things like deep fakes?
We used to think 8-character passwords were long enough at the time too. So yeah, it's as technology increases and things develop, the deep fakes I'm nervous about them because I really don't know how to address them. There's some talk of, do you develop some artificial intelligence that would give you a yes or no, this is my actual boss that I'm talking to? Do you come up with other protocols to do it? It's an interesting problem, and it's only going to get stronger. They say attacks only get better with time. They never get worse. So yeah, we definitely spend some time looking at that one.
Yeah, the baseline is alarming to me because it is moving up, and I'm concerned about how fast it'll move. Jay, in light of the effects of what's going on in the war in Europe, to what degree would you anticipate that the baseline of what constitutes threat vectors and attacks, therefore requiring strengthening of hygienic factors more domestically? What's your assessment? How is that baseline going to change here?
Yeah, so I think it has changed, and it's vertical specific. So energy, for example, or steel manufacturing are prime targets because of the dynamics surrounding the Ukraine, as well as the attacks that are going on there, but also the cyber actors. So we've seen a shift, for example, where you have malicious actors posing as Russians or as Russian groups. Because attribution then becomes, something that's easier, and there's obfuscation that's happening in that process. Chinese actors are very, very present. They're very active, and unfortunately, they have the backing of nation state funding as well as resources. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we're facing, and this has brought things much more into scope. I would say that it's accelerating, unfortunately, the threats and the attacks, as well as the dynamic nature of the new tools, new toolkits that are being used to go and engage with our end users. And I think that one of the most pressing issues that we have is that IT security is fairly mature. When we talk about baseline, there's a clear understanding that you have visibility on the network, you have visibility on the users, and you have visibility on the application level. In OT, no such case. The baseline is very difficult to quantify because you don't have that source of context. So in order to inform cyber hygiene, there's a number of different components that you need to have. And unfortunately, the industry has been very focused on reactive security for the last decade. So understanding indicators of compromise, great. It's good to know that someone is active in your environment, that they've crossed the fence and they're inside your environment. But from an OT perspective, that's already too late. you're being impacted and you need to remediate. And so you're putting out fires. So we're trying to shift the conversation towards risk management, as well as proactively identifying the gaps and exposures in your environment and focusing on the prevention model. So if you're familiar with the bow tie model of risk, and I know we'll talk a little more in detail on risk, but you want to understand where your exposures are and how you're going to be leveraged before you are leveraged. So it's very important to shift towards, prevention, and certainly on the IT side, you can see that the budget spending that's been happening over the last 20 years has been heavily skewed towards prevention. You want to close those attack gaps. You want to manage your surface of attack so that you're minimizing your exposure to the outside world. And we've reached a decent maturity on the IT side. I'm not saying that there are no challenges there, but certainly OT needs to catch up. And the tools are now available to do that. So I think that that's a recognition of where we stand is the first thing that we need to acknowledge in order to try and fix the issues that we have.
And I think it's a fair comment that a great deal of the infrastructure is certainly in energy predates the cyber world's efforts to attack it. It's old SCADA systems are very common, and they're unpatchable. They lack the pathways to upgrade. So we have some risks there. Now we're adding more and more machines. Gary, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on this broader challenge of the introduction of more smarter machines, smarter pumps, smarter control rooms, smarter systems, edge computing. This is creating a machine-to-machine world. And to what degree does cyber hygiene now have to play a role at a machine level, not just a person level?
Yeah, that's a great point, Geoffrey. Look, the technology is moving very fast. And the bottom line is that we're way past the point where humans can keep up with the machines. This is right. We are now dependent upon the machines to defend us from the machines, right? So we have to leverage these technologies that we've developed in the cybersecurity defenses. We have machine learning, we have AI development happening across the industry. And there is no question that state actors, organized crime, and other malicious actors are already leveraging these technologies, right? A great example is the Mirai botnet. This is a piece of software that was put out in the wild years ago, originally by college guys, running Minecraft servers, right, for profit. But this is a system that literally actively propagates itself. As soon as it finds a host, it compromises it. It scans the network for every other host it can find and then compromises those. And then it spreads exponentially. I mean, within the first 6 months of this code being released in the wild, we saw botnets 500,000 strong, right? With the largest we had ever seen in history. And it's been out there for years now. There's tens of thousands of variants. And that's just one example of one piece of malware. So we absolutely have to leverage these same technologies in our defenses, and getting ahead of it, letting the machines go out and do this proactive search. So creating our good guy botnets that can go out and scan the internet and find all the malware, and then make sure that we're remediating that and dealing with it, and that we understand the threat. I think this is a big challenge. I think we have the tools and the technology available to us. We just have to make sure we're applying it appropriately in this cybersecurity world.
Let's wrap this section up, Darren, with a question for you around what is your assessment of the practice levels, the tools and methods people are using to appraise their hygienic factors? Where are we at? Are we where we need to be, or are we falling short?
There's always room for improvement. There's a wide variety of different levels of maturity for these different organizations. Some are doing everything that they need to do. Some aren't. But the answer is not just throwing any tool at the problem. The answer is understanding where your risks are, looking at the best way to address them, and then finding the tools and the people in the process to address that to move forward.
Thanks for that. I'll just call attention to the Q&A box. If it's on your screen, you should feel free to fire questions in if you wish the questions to be addressed to any of Jay, Darren or Gary, just tag them in the question, and I'll make sure that we put them on the spot to answer hard cyber challenges from around the world. Brilliant. All right, let's move on to our third topic. We're at roughly the halfway point. Our third topic is convergence. Now, this has been going on for many years, of course, which is the IT world of ERP systems, emails, desktop support, end user computing is merging together and converging with operations technology, and this is creating its own kinds of new risks. Associated with that, we now have this shift to the adoption of digital technologies, which also bring about their own kinds of risks. And here's the kinds of questions I want to kind of work our way through today. To what degree is our industry, oil and gas, or energy broadly, dealing with this merger or convergence question? Where is this actually headed? Because there are still in many oil and gas companies, digital is still off to the side. It's really not either part of IT or OT. It's kind of its own thing. How does that now have to kind of merge in? How are we managing the risks that come about when we do convergence? Because there are new risks that surface. And what's our assessment of the current state associated with impacts from convergence? How are we tackling that? So Jay, let me start with you, if you don't mind. What is your appraisal? Have you given your travels? What is your appraisal? How prevalent is this convergence of IT and OT in industry?
So I'll refer back to a previous conversation that you and I have had, but I think that we have to separate technical convergence from organizational convergence. So certainly from a technical convergence point of view, we are converged. Our environments are connected. We've resisted it. We've tried not to have it happen. There are still proponents out there that we need to separate the environments. Unfortunately, competitively and organizationally, this is challenging because we need better KPIs. We need to understand real-time metrics about the environment. We want to benefit from the advantages that digital transformation brings to the operational environment, but we want to do so responsibly. And this is the part that's been missing. I think that we've evolved and connected things to our environment without necessarily being concerned about what we're connecting. And it's pretty complex. There are devices out there that we have no visibility on the age of the OS or the firmware, where it comes from, who is it's gone through, what are the manufacturing and coding practices that go into the product. And we often come across devices that have operating systems that are 10, 12, 15 years old, that have never been patched. So you inheriting this stack of vulnerabilities and potential threat vectors when you're actually acquiring these products. And sometimes it's not even about the product itself. It'll be about how the building blocks that go into it are made. So bring this into focus. I might inherit a device that is manufactured in China, that has a certain specific operation system or a certain firmware, and they all bring with their set of challenges. Then I might have embedded components in it, like VxWorks, for example, that has its own set of vulnerabilities that I don't even know that I own because it's nowhere to be seen that this is embedded in the stack of product that I'm buying. So, you know, and you're inheriting things through mergers and acquisitions, and you end up in a circumstance where you're basically unaware of what exists in your environment and how you're going to address it. So it is very, very challenging to bring ourselves to a point where we have a good understanding of what actually we're being tasked with protecting.
I think that's a great point. The key takeaway for me here is whether we think about it or not, whether we agree with it or not, technically we are converged. We may organizationally behave like we're not, but that's to our detriment. And the more we kind of think about it as a converged question, probably the better off we're going to be. And so, Gary, just turning to you on this question of directions, specifically on digital, I still continue to see lots and lots of digital pilot projects out there that seem to be running disconnected, unintegrated, on their own, very experimental. Where does that, I mean, this does not feel like a good practice to me. What is your sense of the direction here? Are we going to be pulling these digital projects in underneath a more coordinated cyber umbrella?
Well, I think that it's important, regardless of how we decide to proceed in this transformation, that we understand the risks. And I know I keep beating on that, but really that is ultimately the challenge. We know we have these converged systems, right? And, to Jay's point, whether you intentionally converge those systems or whether it was part of a plan, whether that's organizationally or programmatically converged, or it's just a physical reality that you have no control over. The convergence is there, and it's been happening for years. And so, if we don't acknowledge those risks and we don't start to address them, then we're going to have real problems. I mean, Colonial Pipeline is just one example. There are many, many others that are very real, that happen on a daily basis. And of course, most of them we don't even hear about, right? So I think it's really about understanding what we can do and then consciously choosing to start to apply those controls and apply those security solutions. There's no question that IT has been on this journey for some time, and maybe, is a little bit farther down that road, but there's a lot of lessons learned that we can apply to the OT world as well. And I think it would be behoove us to, start at the very least converging the conversations between those two organizations and leveraging that experience that we have in the IT world so that we can apply it more broadly.
More broadly, exactly right. Now, you mentioned, as you said, that you feel that we should always be bringing this back to the risk discussion. Are there some specific kind of almost like keynote or headline new risks that convergence can bring that you can use in a conversation to say, this is a specific risk and we should be talking about it, and specifically thinking around convergence issues?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately the risk is much greater because we're talking about industrial control systems. I mean, we're talking about fuel. We're talking about power plants. We're talking about energy production. We're talking about clean water systems, and I mean, the list goes on. I mean, I can think of an example recently in Florida where a water treatment plant was attacked, and they were attempting to adjust the chemical balance and essentially turning drinking water into poison. I mean, this is, these can be life-threatening events. So when we calculate risk, loss of money is one thing, but when we're talking about loss of life, that's a whole nother level. And I think that's what we're dealing with many of these systems. And I think we need to elevate the conversation to that level to understand what's at risk beyond just, monetary or reputational impact, right?
Yeah, it's still very significant. I'm just looking for any questions in Q&A. If anybody has anything to our panelists, feel free to fire those into the Q&A box, and we will field them appropriately. Darren, let's have last word to you around the assessment of convergence risks. We've talked already about how boards appraise risk and they're very attuned to risk. What is your assessment of these risks and how important they are, the significance of them, particularly as it relates to convergence?
Sure. When you bring IT folks and OT folks together, the IT folks are going to tell the OT folks, let's patch some stuff, because this stuff's all running really old software. So the risks look the same to the IT folks, but they're completely different, meaning you can't just go and do that. There's a lot of other things that you need to keep in mind when it comes to OT technology. Sure, they may not be patched, but we may have other controls. They're not open to patching. It's an engineered process, generally speaking. So it's something that was built for purpose, and you can't just change it willy-nilly. So you have to keep that in mind for sure. Also, on the cyber risk side of it, alluding to what Gary was talking about, potential mischief, or people in the early days of hacking and poking at these systems, people were doing it because they wanted to know what they could do. Now they're doing it to make money, but also there's still some folks out there that are just poking around causing mischief, and we don't want to take the risk of that leading to loss of life. That would be something that would be very serious, and you definitely want to consider that when you're assessing.
Yeah, it's a critical. It's probably, if there's a takeaway here, is that the risk of theft of user IDs and credit cards is one kind of risk, but risk where you transform a water supply into poison and kill people is a completely different scale of risk. And so for those of us who work in the world of cyber, we have to maintain the clear eye on what is the caliber of the risk that we're facing, and then therefore what should we be doing to make sure we manage that risk. So a great takeaway from that discussion. Let me turn to the final topic, which is risk management. And Gary's touched on this repeatedly in the conversation today. The risk management and the thinking of risk is one of the critical things we need to be very, very mindful of. And a good practice here is an imperative. So let's kind of work our way through risk management just to make sure we're on the same page. What do we mean when we say risk management? Is it changing? Is it different in an operations world versus a non-operational world? Who does this really well? Oil and gas likes to follow the leader. So I'm curious to know what your assessments are about who out in industry is actually really good at this. Third is the impacts of the war. How is that driving our attention and our thinking around risk management? And then finally, are there some new practices in risk management that we need to and we could potentially take on board? Jay, let's start right off the bat with this question of definitions. Is the definition of risk management, as you frame it for companies and organizations, is it changing or is it still relatively stable?
I think that the industry is shifting towards risk. I think that we've gone through different adoption of methodology to secure our environments, and we've had waves of different technologies that have been effective, some less than others. And I think that we've migrated towards a pattern that now we're seeing that many of the investments that we've made in the past are great standalone solutions that can contribute to maintaining the posture of the organization, but they need to collaborate. And this is where one of the main challenges that we have now is around tying risk to the actual assets, controls that we have, and potential sources of risk that threaten the organization. And it could be, that risk doesn't necessarily have to be tied to malicious actors. It could be insider threat, it could be safety concerns, it could be lack of operational practices, or lack of audit and control on these things. So ideally, you want to have an understanding of what your sources of risk are, identifying those, putting control measures, and assessing the control measures in order to be able to understand what's working and what's not working, because typically it leads to a common risk event, and that risk event will then inform your recovery measures and your potential consequences or impacts on your environment. So that risk journey is something that we want to cultivate and that we want to automate as much as possible. So certainly now the tool sets are available to inform, to provide that continuous risk management against your environment, to assess all of your data sources and provide you with a factual data-driven assessment of your environment. So we've moved forward in terms of what's available to support the organization to get properly informed. The processes, the approach, as well as the understanding of this risk is still not quite there. I often have conversations with end users where risk is tied to vulnerability when they're very different things. The basic definition of risk is frequency. How often can this happen? And what will be the impact or the damages against your environment or your organization? So tying those things together gives you a better understanding of what the risk is to the organization. Now you have to inform it with the right sources of data as well as the right audit mechanism to be able to inform yourself. And certainly visibility takes a big role here, but visibility needs context. So we've invested a lot in technologies to provide asset inventory in OT, for example. That's good. Understanding vulnerabilities, that's good too. But you need to remove the noise and the false positives that surround that. It's not because an asset has a vulnerability that it may be at risk or be putting the organization at risk. You need to understand the context around it. Is it reachable? What role does the asset play? What hierarchy does it belong to? Who is it communicating with? What protocols? Is it properly buried or insulated? Has it been segmented properly? And so on and so on. So these are all data points and controls that we want to have in place to properly inform risk And this is part of the conversations that we have on a daily basis.
Gary, just turning to you around this definition and baseline, are there new elements, new aspects of risk management conversations that you're seeing now?
Yeah, look, I think that the risks are, of course, ever changing, and we've identified a lot of this in the conversation already today.
Yeah.
We know that we are protecting assets. We know, I think Jay was talking early on about how much we've invested over the last couple of decades in prevention, right? That has been the biggest emphasis. And I certainly, want to encourage everyone to maintain those efforts. But we know that prevention alone is not fully effective. We know that breaches are going to happen. We know malicious insiders exist, right? We know things will go wrong. But the real question is any harm done by it, right? And I think part of that risk assessment is understanding the outcomes or the potential outcomes of those incidents. The average dwell time for malware on a network is in the hundreds of days. I don't know what the latest stat is, but I know it's hundreds of days, approaching a year, right? So that means you have hundreds of days to act before something goes wrong, before valuable information or assets are exfiltrated from the network. So, focusing on that and saying, can we stop it before harm is done? I think there's a real value in that risk assessment, not just, focusing on that prevention aspect. And I think the level of the risk, of course, is changing too. We've talked a lot about the war, in Europe right now, and how that increases risks. Look, state actors have vast resources, and they don't just attack other states. They attack industries, they attack corporations, they attack infrastructure, right? These are primary targets. And that happens both in wartime and in peacetime. And we also know, look, going all the way back to Stuxnet, we know that some of these tools that are developed by nation states for very specific attacks on another nation state end up getting out in the wild and used against everyone. And make no mistake, that will continue happening. We know for a fact that, there are Russian state actors who moonlight as cyber criminals, right? So they're honing their skills on the cyber battlefield, but then turning that toward for-profit endeavors for their own gain. And, that's just one example. So I think definitely the landscape is changing, the risks are increasing, and it's really behooves us to be paying attention to where we can have the most impact.
Yeah, one of the risks was reported to me in an earlier podcast I did was the rise of quantum computing and its ability to crack most known encryption. And you couple that with the amount of data that's already been stolen or hacked out of corporate systems, which is encrypted and therefore secure today, but it won't be secure once quantum computing takes off. It's going to cause some chaos because that data is going to be unencrypted and then accessible. So it brings us to the question, who actually is an industrial leader, regardless of the industry? Who would you look to as demonstrating the best practice in risk management when it comes to cyber? For example, some industries have been tacked earlier, banks, for instance, entertainment companies, because people go after their login IDs, their credit cards. So who's really good at this? Darren, let me turn to you as a first thought. Who would you point to say, hey, this industry is, they seem to be better at this than others?
I think the industries with the most to lose. So I think we're looking at banks, insurance companies, folks like that. I know their investment in cyber is quite high compared to the rest of industry out there. Beyond that, who's behind them? I don't have a good sense for that right now.
Do you have a sense as to what the proportion of, or the quantum of their spend? It's quite high, but what does that actually translate to?
No, I'm not aware.
Yeah, it's a very interesting number to get at, which is because you can kind of see, well, this is how much people are having to spend to secure themselves. Jay, what about in your experience? Which industry do you admire most because it seems to be furthest ahead in this world of cyber protections?
Yeah, so I think Darren made a good point, right? To a certain extent, I think that there's a lot of visibility and there's certainly a lot of attention around money and anything directly related to wealth. So I think that by default, insurance companies and banks and the financial sector will tend to invest. Now they have mature teams, they have good investment in technology as well as having more resources than the average company. And I'm going to shift in a second over the operational side of things, the operational technology or the industrial side of things. But I think there's some lessons still to be learned there, right? So prevention is key, but as Gary has mentioned, your ability to recover is even more important. I think that the longer you're going to be impacted, this is where the real damage and the real losses become significant. So if a cyber actor is present in your environment for hundreds of days, they're not being idle. So there is layers and tiers of cyber criminal that are exploiting your environment, and then they pass it off to the other one, right? So this is where we end up often with ransomware events that are at the tail end of that process, because ransomware is very visible. It's very impactful. So data exfiltration or theft of intellectual property, that comes before. So as you close the door and you put the key in the lock and you say, pay me or you don't get your stuff back, there is no guarantee there that they haven't already taken what's been valuable in your environment. So yes, there are still lessons and there have still been breaches in those sectors. So we need to understand that these are still complex environments with a lot of different threats. Desjardins, a few years ago, had a massive insider threat happen to its environment. That's very hard to protect against. And I have sympathy for them because it's a difficult circumstances. Protecting yourself against your own employees and your own processes, yeah, lessons learned there as well, right? So we're always reducing surface of attack, but we're unfortunately learning from, to Darren's point again, for tabletop exercises, you'd better practice first before you have to react to a real world event. So let's shift the conversation to the industrial side. I admire utilities. Utilities have a huge risk profile. They have an always extending edge. So if you talk to anyone about distributed energy resources and how they're having to assume new risk because their edge is always expanding and they're taking on that risk because frankly, they can't trust others to do it for them. So there's also a correlation there that this is one of the most regulated environments. So if you bring compliance into play, compliance and security are two different things, but one serves the other. So compliance has forced visibility, it has forced audit, it has forced a certain maturity, and it doesn't go the whole way, but it gets you part of the way there in understanding your environment. So I admire utilities because often in Canada, especially, they struggle with fixed rates and limited budgets and limited teams and resources. So they have to find a way to do more with less. Energy is not far behind, but again, if you don't have regulation, you don't have that stick that is going to drive lessons in because there is a failure to comply and then there are financial impacts. Where we also see this is there's a lot of regulation or a lot of compliance standards that are being pushed in peer-to-peer engagements. I might have supply chain obligations, I might have partnerships, and these partners may obligate me to meet certain standards or certain audits. And this is to a certain extent good for the industry because it pushes maturity forward. But it needs to go further than that. We need to be proactive when it comes to security and identifying our risks. So sorry for the long answer. This is one of my favorite topics. So
as I'm pushing buttons and with cyber professionals, you got to get switched on to certain things. We're very quickly approaching the end of our time. I want to do a quick wrap up here shortly. So Gary, I'll just leave the last word to you on this whole question of practices related to risk management. Are there any new developments that people might want to be aware of?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, and others have mentioned, we've been very focused on prevention. I think that needs to shift. We need to, put more energy into this mitigation and also more energy into resiliency, right? So, Jay talked about that. It's more a measure of how quickly you recover when you are breached or when you have an incident, because we all know that these incidents are going to happen. So I think really focusing more on that and more energy on recovery and more energy on resiliency, I think, is the key.
That's brilliant. All right, our last wrap-up conversation here. I'm just looking at, there's no open questions on the Q&A, so I'll just wrap with kind of one key takeaway from each of you. What one thing would you take away from this conversation today? And Jay, we'll start with you, and then I'll go to Darren, and then we'll wrap up with Gary. So Jay, over to you first.
So I'll apologize in advance for the dogs in the background. So that's just the reality of working from home now. But So I think one of the takeaways here is to understand who you are in terms of a risk profile and how attractive you can be, or how much in demand you can be as an end user from a cyber criminal perspective. There is never an unprofitable transaction for a cyber criminal. They will always find something in your environment to monetize. Whether that's damaging you, whether that's finding leverage points or pain points within the organization. So I think that there is a lack of understanding that, I'll take an example when we talk about HVAC systems. This is one of the very typical things that comes back, and often the response that I get is, yeah, but that's an isolated network and it's properly segmented, and okay, fair point. However, that could be a leverage point against your organization. It can become a pain point, because if you work in a warm country and I can turn off the AC for your staff, it's going to become very uncomfortable for them to work in the office. And that becomes a pain point, but it was a leverage point against you. And these leverage points, it's important to identify them within the organization to understand how they can be leveraged and where they will lead. So I think that we need to do a better job to educate, and there's tons of great resources out there. NIST, IEC, there's a number of different professional organizations. They make content available. It's greatly organized and structured. We have to do a better job to educate our end users and the stakeholders that we interact with. This is on us to help them move forward and get that visibility and awareness that they need.
So education is your key takeaway. Darren, over to you. What would be your one takeaway from today?
Security is not a binary. It's not on or off. It's a process. It's a journey. It takes time. It takes education. It takes learning. It takes practice. So the sooner you start, the further down the road you're going to be when, unfortunately, you're going to get compromised.
There you go. Yep, it's inevitable. And Gary, finally, last word to you. What key takeaway would you take from today?
I'd say really focus on visibility, and I'd like to expand just a little bit on that, right? So we have lots of solutions for visibility. We all know you can't stop what you can't see, and hence a lot of emphasis on that. But if we think about the visibility we typically have deployed today, it often relies on things like logs. It relies on sample data. Why? Because networks are vast. We have millions of endpoints. There's just so much to monitor. But then what we end up with is monitoring systems where we get 1 million alerts a day. If you're getting 1 million alerts a day and you have a staff of 10 people, how many are they going to respond to, right? So we not only need good visibility, we need granular visibility, we need deep and broad visibility, but we have to apply the machine learning and the AI to filter through that and to separate the wheat from the chaff, because otherwise it's just going to be overwhelming.
Well, that brings us to a terrific end to this conversation. As a raffle, everyone who's attended today, if you're out there and participating in this, your name is going to be entered into a drawing for copies of my latest book, which will be coming to you. We'll be in touch with you through email. And as our acknowledgement and our thank you for taking the time to take in this really important conversation. So that brings to an end this discussion. I'm sure you've taken great value from the conversation, and here's to everyone who's participated. Thanks all. We'll just call it a wrap here and let you get back to your days. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.